I've been asked a lot recently that as the channel is 5 years old, would I consider doing a live stream, a question and answer session, or be interviewed by another channel? I've never done this before, as I never really thought that anyone would be interested. And as of course this is a historical crime channel, the cases are far more important. However, Briefcase would not be anything without all of you. So if this is something that you would like to see, or not, please let me know in the comment section below. Today we will be looking at a case from the mid-19th century. But before I ask you to sit back and say that we are going to Scotland, I would like to introduce you to today's sponsor, Merge Restaurant. If you haven't heard of Merge Restaurant, it's a fun and relaxing merge-to-puzzle game where you can help Chef Mina rebuild a restaurant and turn it into a huge success. One great thing about Merge Restaurant is that the gameplay is easy to learn and really exciting, so you'll be having fun in no time. I really like to play in my spare time, and it's so satisfying building your own restaurant and unlocking different themed restaurants as you progress in the game. Another great feature is that you can even merge ingredients to create new unique dishes, and best of all, it's a free-to-play mobile game, so everyone can enjoy it. Merge Restaurant's storyline is really engaging and full of twists and turns. You'll be rooting for Mina as she tries to overcome her rival and become the best chef in town. So if you're looking for a fun and relaxing game, then Merge Restaurant is a perfect one for you. You can download Merge Restaurant and start playing today by clicking on the link in the description. And now, back to the video. In the middle of the 19th century, Glasgow stood as a bustling industrial hub, teeming with activity. The city, located on the banks of the River Clyde in Scotland, was experiencing the height of the Industrial Revolution, propelling it into the forefront of global trade and manufacturing. At the heart of Glasgow's rapid growth lay industrial prowess. The city had transformed into a powerhouse of shipbuilding, textile production, and heavy engineering. With so many industries all needing workers, many people came to the city seeking employment and better opportunities. Glasgow became a rural magnet. Its population increased to unprecedented levels. However, with this rapid expansion came the challenge of accommodating and providing for the growing population. The city's housing situation was not at all good, especially for those who found themselves in the lower socio-economic levels. Tenement buildings, characterised by multiple families occupying small, cramped spaces, became quite normal. But these buildings often lacked proper sanitation and ventilation. However, it was in this overcrowded and impoverished environment that many of Glasgow's working-class residents lived. Conditions inside these buildings were harsh. Families were squeezed into a single room, sharing limited resources. Diseases such as cholera were rampant due to the unsanitary living conditions and lack of clean water. The occupants of these buildings lived an impoverished existence, with many residents struggling to make ends meet, often resorting to desperate measures to survive. Despite the hardships faced by the working class, Glasgow was not without its charms. The city's cultural scene flourished, with theatres, music halls, and public libraries serving as beacons of enlightenment and entertainment. The Glasgow School of Art was founded in 1845, which nurtured budding artists and designers, contributing to the city's growing reputation as a centre for creativity. However, while the city's industrial might and cultural offerings painted a vibrant picture, Glasgow faced significant challenges in terms of public health and social inequality. This had meant that many of the city's residents were trapped in a cycle of despair. The area of the city where Miss Helen Blackwood resided was one such place. She was a young woman who found her life was a daily struggle against the harsh realities of poverty and inequality. Helen lived in a tenement building in Crowley's Land, in the new Vennel area of Glasgow. She lived in a cramped room, along with a young man named Hans Smith McFarland, with who for some time she had been engaged in a relationship, and with two young ladies named Mary Hamilton and Anne Marshall, both women who faced the harsh realities of survival in an unforgiving society and had started to work as prostitutes. However, as well as Helen, Hans, Mary and Anne, there were also two young brothers who shared the room. Their names were William and James Shillinglaw. William was 11 years old and his brother was just 9. Their father had died and their mother lived in extremely poor circumstances. The children did occasionally attend school, but life for them in Victorian Britain was bleak and their existence was marked by hardship and uncertainty. Children who found themselves alone, either because they'd been abandoned by their parents or their parents had died, often found themselves living in crowded workhouses or on the streets, struggling to survive. But luckily for William and James, Hans had taken pity on them and invited them to stay in the room. The 11th of June 1853 was a Saturday, in the middle of the Scottish summer. During this period, people sought respite from the city's bustling industrial landscape and embraced the opportunity to enjoy the weather and the outdoors. Families flocked to Glasgow Green, which was the city's oldest and most expansive public park and dated back to the 15th century. The park offered a welcome retreat with its lush green lawns, winding pathways and the gentle flow to the River Clyde. Mary Hamilton and Anne Marshall decided to go out and look for clients. Saturday was always good for business, and although it had been raining, it was now a hot sunny day, and they did not want to waste the opportunity to make some money. However, they did not go to the park. Instead, they made their way into the city centre. Here they became acquainted with 2 men, sailors on leave from the Merchant Navy. Their names were Alexander Boyd and James Law, and both had been drinking heavily throughout the day. Mary and Anne joined them, but they themselves did not participate in much drinking. After a while, Mary suggested that the men came back to their room, which of course they agreed to. By this time both were quite drunk. Beer, gin and whiskey flowed freely within the working class taverns and slum dwellings. Alcohol acted as both a temporary respite and a destructive force, exacerbating social problems, and in the mid-19th century this sometimes led to violent confrontations. However, on this particular evening, the men were unconcerned and just wanted to enjoy the time away from the ship. Mary arrived first, accompanied by James Law. His senses had been dulled by excessive drinking. Anne and Alexander Boyd arrived a few minutes later, but Mr. Boyd's drunken state meant that he was barely able to comprehend his surroundings. Before they had time to pour another drink, Helen came back to the small room, accompanied by Mr. Hans Smith McFarland. The atmosphere suddenly changed. It was like an air of tension had been injected into the already crowded space. The 2 young Shillinglaw brothers, William and James, lay tucked beneath Helen's bed, their sleep disrupted by the noise. Sensing an opportunity, Helen cunningly procured money from Alexander Boyd and ventured outside to acquire more whiskey. On her return, Mary put something into Mr. Boyd's cup and poured liquor from the newly acquired bottle into it. She then handed the cup to the unsuspecting gentleman, who was oblivious to what she had done, and quickly consumed its contents. However, this only caused his already unsteady movements to become even more erratic. He suddenly became aggressive, and in a drunken rage, he aimed a wild punch at Helen. Fortunately, it missed. Miss Helen Blackwood, however, was someone who had been brought up in unrelenting circumstances and had learned how to look after herself. She immediately grabbed the nearest object to hand, which was a chamber pot, and hit the poor man over the head with it. She hit him so hard that the pot broke into pieces, and Mr. Alexander Boyd fell to the floor and hit his head on a stone that was used as a stool. He was in a very bad way, completely unconscious, and Hans wondered if he may be dead. Instead of trying to help the poor man, they made a callous attempt to try and find any money or valuable items that he may have had on his person. Helen and Anne stripped him down to his undergarments. Having done that, and finding little reward, the evening then took a very strange and unexpected turn, when Miss Helen Blackwood, Mr. Hans Smith McFarland, and Miss Anne Marshall, for some inexplicable reason, decided to throw the gentleman out of the window. They resided on the 3rd floor, and as he dropped to the cobbles below, an eerie thud echoed around Crawley's Land. Realising that Mr. Boyd was now almost certainly dead, Anne rushed to the window and dramatically shouted, "My man's dead. He went to the window and fell over it. To further mask the heinous crime, she hastily discarded the shattered remnants of the chamber pot, thus perpetuating the illusion that Mr. Boyd's demise had been a tragic accident. The commotion drew neighbours to their windows and doors, eager to witness the aftermath of what had just occurred and to speculate on the circumstances that had led to such a horrific accident. A passing policeman responded to the disturbance. He looked at the body lying on the cobbles and ascertained that the man was dead. Assistance soon arrived and an investigation began to try and unravel how the poor man had met his demise. Word of this most unfortunate and untimely death quickly spread throughout the area. In the tightly knit community, where gossip was rife, the tragedy served as a grim reminder of how fragile life could be in this impoverished part of the city. Helen, Hans, Mary and Anne fled the scene as officers started to look for witnesses. Local residents described what they had seen and heard and how the tragedy had unfolded. However, it was the young Shillinglaw brothers who were able to tell the officers exactly what had happened, as the noise and the commotion had woken them and they had seen the whole macabre event from under Miss Helen Blackwood's bed. The deceased man's friend, Mr. James Law, was also able to assist with the investigation. Miss Helen Blackwood, Mr. Hans Smith McFarland, Miss Mary Hamilton and Miss Anne Marshall were arrested the following day and charged with murder. The whole of Scotland seemed fascinated with the case that was heard in the High Court in Edinburgh on the 21st of July 1853, just 6 weeks after the death of Mr. Boyd. With the public's interest, the press dedicated many columns in their newspapers to what was happening in the trial. The courtroom, with its grand architecture and imposing atmosphere, served as a stage where the realities of life in the city's slums were laid bare for all to see, and the harsh reality for Glasgow's poor, who lived in such miserable conditions, were very much exposed. The proceedings commenced, with the prosecution painting a vivid picture of the scene in Helen's overcrowded tenement room. Through witness testimonies and medical evidence, they told of the events that led up to Mr. Alexander Boyd's tragic demise. The jury listened intently, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity, shock and concern. The Shillinglaw brothers took the stand, their small faces barely visible from behind the towering witness box. Their young voices trembled as they recounted the terrifying moments they had witnessed beneath Helen Blackwood's bed. Their innocent eyes betrayed a burden far too heavy for their tender years. It was a moment that encapsulated the harsh realities faced by children living in poverty and desperation. William Shillinglaw told of how on the 11th of June, 2 men came back to the room with Miss Hamilton and Miss Marshall. He said they were drunk, but the ladies seemed very much normal. He described how Mr. Boyd had given money to Helen to buy whiskey, and how Mary added something to the cup, which Mr. Boyd then drank. William described how the man started gasping and then tried to strike Helen, who in an attempt to defend herself, hit him with the chamber pot, knocking him to the floor, where his head hit the stone stool. William said that it was Miss Helen Blackwood's idea to strip the man in search of money, and once that was done, Hans McFarland shouted, "Throw him over the window." He added that it was Helen, Hans and Anne who picked the man up and threw him head first to the cobbles below. Meanwhile, Mary Hamilton looked on, somewhat horrified. He went on to say that after this, the 4 adults left the room. Miss Blackwood was last to leave. She blew out the candle and locked the door behind her. He said that not long after the police arrived, they knocked the door down and took him and his brother to the police station. Another witness was a teenage girl named Miss Jane Leith. She said that she had been out with her friend, Miss Mary Kellen, and that they had seen Mary Hamilton and Anne Marshall with 2 men. She knew of the women, as she lived in the same building, and decided to follow them. She told the court that she watched through the cracks in the door and saw Helen Blackwood hit Mr. Boyd with the chamber pot. She said that she also witnessed the 4 residents throwing the poor gentleman out of the window. She added that she heard Miss Blackwood say, "We will get a shilling for his umbrella on Monday morning. Besides that, we'll get something for his clothes." When asked if the defendant seemed to have been drinking, She replied that it did not. The weight of her testimony was striking, leaving an indelible impression on those present. Dr. Easton, who carried out the post-mortem with Dr. McGregor, informed the court that they found no traces of any substance in the deceased, such as arsenic, opium, or any metallic irritants. The defence, faced with an arduous task, sought to cast doubt on the credibility of the witnesses and challenge the prosecution's version of events. They spoke of the chaotic and intoxicated nature of the gathering, arguing that the memories of those who had testified may have been clouded by confusion, rumour, and gossip. They also painted a vivid picture of the four accused as victims themselves, trapped in a cycle of poverty and despair. Despite this, the prosecution's case remained formidable. The medical experts took the stand, presenting their findings and explaining how the deceased man's injuries aligned with falling from a significant height. They were, however, unable to say whether or not he was dead before he was thrown from the window. The task for the jury was daunting. They had to assess the culpability of the accused in the context of society struggling to grapple with its own issues. When the trial ended, the judge summed up the case before sending the jury out to deliberate. They did so for some time, before returning with the verdict of guilty for Miss Helen Blackwood, guilty for Mr. Hans Smith McFarland, and guilty for Miss Anne Marshall, but a verdict of not proven for Miss Mary Hamilton. This created a mixed reaction in court. There were those who interpreted it as a concession to the uncertainties and complexities of the case, while others saw it as an acknowledgement of Mary's lesser involvement. However, the verdicts of guilty for the other three defendants cast a solemn atmosphere over the courtroom. The weight of their actions bore down heavily upon them, and their faces etched a mix of resignation and remorse. Helen, Hans and Anne would soon face the grim reality of their fates. They were taken back to the new jail, where they awaited their execution. Following the trial, its impact reverberated throughout Glasgow. The city's residents grappled with their own conscience, forced to confront the deep-rooted issues plaguing their society. Poverty, overcrowding, and systematic neglect had led to many people leaving a life of violence, vice and despair. The trial served as a reminder of the urgent need for reform and social change. Somewhat surprisingly, that despite her involvement in this heinous crime, Miss Anne Marshall was recommended for mercy and subsequently spared from the gallows. Instead, she was sentenced to transportation to Australia. The decision sparked a wave of criticism and disbelief in the press, as many people believed that her level of culpability warranted a more severe punishment. Many people questioned the fairness of her reprieve, feeling that it did not align with the weight of the evidence against her. Meanwhile, within the confines of the prison walls, Hans sought solace and a semblance of normality by applying to marry Helen. Unfortunately, the authorities denied his request, believing it to be inappropriate to allow such a union amidst the couple's impending fate. Thursday, the 11th of August 1853, was a day of Helen and Hans' execution. The atmosphere outside the new jail was quite sombre. Although thousands of people still gathered, their presence a stark reminder of society's fascination with public spectacles of punishment. The hangings were overseen by William Calcraft, a renowned executioner who had travelled to Glasgow from London. Yet even in the face of impending death, Helen and Hans found solace in a fleeting moment of love and commitment. With a firm and unwavering voice, Hans proposed to Helen, saying, "Helen Blackwood, before God and in the presence of these witnesses, I take you to be my wife. Do you consent?" Helen replied that she did. Hans then said, "Then before these witnesses, I declare that you be what you have always been to me, a true and faithful wife, and you die an honest woman." The chaplain added an amen, and under Scottish law of the time, Miss Helen Blackwood and Mr. Hans Smith McFarlane were legally married. Unfortunately, this impromptu marriage declaration was quickly dissolved by the release of the trap, and the couple were hanged side by side. Following the hanging, the crowd dispersed, carrying with them tales of the marriage and the execution. and the newspapers were able to fill even more columns with the story of the couple who were married on the gallows. In the aftermath, Glasgow continued to grapple with the deep-rooted social issues as the shadows of poverty, vice and inequality continued to loom over the city. The case of Miss Helen Blackwood and her companions served as a tragic symbol of the hardship faced by the working class, who are often victims of circumstances beyond their control. Some newspapers also use this case to remind its readers of the ever-present consequences of social neglect and the fragility of the human spirit when pushed to its limits. I would again like to thank Merge Restaurant for sponsoring today's video, and to download the game, all you have to do is go to the link below. Please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case